The chapter that took Berserk from being a really well-written dark fantasy story to a masterpiece of the genre was Chapter 73. As Griffith knelt in that prophesized red lake, behelit in hand, crying tears of blood surrounded by apostles, you knew something super messed up was about to happen. And boy did it. The sun died a crimson death and plunged the lives of every character in Berserk into a nightmare that they still haven't woken up from. That's right, folks. Today, we're talking about the Eclipse. The single most important moment in the history of Berserk, the Eclipse is a ritual that has become synonymous with the series in the years since it began, and with good reason. Complex and layered on the surface, but cruelly simple at its core, it's a ceremony that lies at the heart of the main conflict being addressed in Berserk, so let's take a deep dive into its history, its significance, and how it works. This is the Eclipse from Berserk Explained. An omen of evil the world over. How eclipses have been perceived since ancient times and how it relates to Berserk. These days, we know that eclipses pretty much occur at least twice a year, at least somewhere on Earth. But back in ancient times, we didn't possess half the connectivity that we did as far back as even the 1920s. So understanding that eclipses were a fairly common occurrence wasn't really possible. So how is an eclipse explained then? Using mythology, of course. In ancient China, it was believed that a solar eclipse occurred when a celestial dragon devoured the sun. To make that dragon go away, Chinese people would bang pots and pans and cause as much of a ruckus as possible to scare it off. The Hindu myth about the demon Rahu claims that once the gods and the demons banded together to obtain the nectar of immortality by churning the cosmic seas. But the gods intended to betray the demons and keep the elixir for themselves, so they asked Vishnu for his assistance, and the primordial preserver of the Hindu pantheon took on the form of a beautiful woman to distract the demons once the churning was over, so that the gods could sneak away with their bounty. One of the demons saw through this deception, however, and managed to get a sip of the nectar of immortality before Vishnu beheaded him with his Sudarshana chakra. Since then, Rahu's undying head has been circling the heavens, locked in an eternal chase of the sun, and it was believed that whenever Rahu would swallow the sun, an eclipse would occur. It would be over by the time it passed out of his throat because, remember, this is a giant floating cosmic head we're talking about, but you get the point. In Japanese culture, it's believed that an eclipse was caused when the sun goddess Amaterasu descended from the heavens and hid herself in a cave. The legend states that she was only brought out of the cave by use of a mirror, and thus there exists a tradition of holding up jewelry towards the heavens in Japan whenever an eclipse occurs. These are some of the different interpretations of what an eclipse means on a cultural level, but on a spiritual level, it has always been seen as an omen of bad times, because of the significance that was placed on the sun and moon in prehistoric and historic cultures. Perhaps the most peaceful cultural expression of an eclipse comes from the Bata Maliba peoples of West Africa, who believe that eclipses occur when human infighting and conflict spills over to the heavens. So they spend their time trying to quell conflicts and bring peace between themselves in hopes that it would cause the sun and moon to stop their cosmic brawl as well. Of course, scientifically speaking, every eclipse is bound to end within a few minutes, but science wasn't as much of a thing in prehistoric China, India, or Western Africa, and so these esoteric interpretations of an eclipse always tend to be associated with negative connotations because it disrupted their sense of normalcy. It's these cultural and mythic connotations that Kentaro Miura migrates over to his series, only you can't make his eclipses go away with pots and pans or shiny rings. You almost always have to take the Incan route, which means human sacrifice. Though recorded only in extreme cases, Incan culture was highly sun-centric, and eclipses were taken as a sign of the sun's displeasure with and wrath towards its worshippers. In the pursuit of sating the sun's anger, the Incans would often fast and, yes, even sacrifice people on occasion as a ritual to appease the sun. But where the scope and scale of human sacrifices with the Incan people during eclipse remains limited and tiny respective, there is no questioning the moral fiber of what Berserk's eclipses mean. Demons, sacrifices, and humans reincarnating into entities that are heralds of evil. Kentaro Miura tuned up the esoteric evils associated with an eclipse in the real world for his series, and it results in one of the most harrowing moments in manga history. What differences are there between an eclipse in Berserk and a real-life eclipse? How frequently do they occur? Eclipses work a little differently in the world of Berserk. Now, usually an eclipse occurs when the shadow of one celestial object falls upon another celestial object because it passes between the two. On planet Earth, those three objects are some combination of the Earth, the Sun, and the Moon. Now, from a technical standpoint, eclipses in Berserk are total solar eclipses. Just look at this picture of the eclipse sun from Chapter 75. It's completely completely blocked out, and you can see the solar prominences beaming out from behind it. It's actually pretty similar to the total solar eclipse that happened on August 11th, 1999, and later depictions of the same sun back up that resemblance, like this one from chapter 95. Miura even uses the technical term for this as his chapter title for the debut of his infernal ceremony, as the proper Japanese translation for the kanji used for eclipse in Miura's series is occultation, which is the term for when a celestial object perfectly places itself in the middle of two other celestial objects. The sci-fi science influence doesn't end there, because the eclipse we see in Miura's series is the 5th of its kind, and the gap between the 4 that came before it somewhat lines up with how eclipses work in the real world as well. In our world, it takes an average of about 375 years for an eclipse to recur at a certain point. For example, the last recorded eclipse in Seattle was 1860. The next one will be in 2645. Miura's eclipses recur at the same place once every 216 years, which is a shorter time frame, but we do know that they recur in the same region because of the way eclipses have been recorded in the Berserk verse. The only time we see an eclipse being referred to in a historical record is in chapter 95, when the Holy Iron Chain Knights bring up the prophecy of the Falcon. That prophecy starts with the line, "When the sun dies 5 times," which is Miura using an ancient Chinese interpretation of an eclipse to add weight to his work when he says the sun dies. But the 5 is what's more important here. It implies that the last 4 eclipses also took place in the Midland region, or at the very least within Holy See territory, which expands westward from the center of Berserk's continent of man. So yeah, there's some scientific resemblance between the eclipses in Berserk and eclipses in the real world, but the biggest difference is this. In the real world, you don't need a trigger to cause an eclipse, it just happens naturally as the sun, moon, and earth move about with their orbits. In Berserk, each time an eclipse occurs, it feels like a natural occurrence, but it's really being triggered by something that has the power to control fate itself. And this is where things start deviating from logic. What causes an eclipse in Berserk? What is the meaning behind it? In the world of Berserk, an eclipse takes place when a Behelit is activated, the Crimson Behelit to be precise. If you look closely at the sun behind Griffith in chapter 72 when he has his infamous last ride, it's pretty close to setting. There's no hint of an incoming eclipse or any kind of unusual celestial activity at all. It's only after Griffith picks up the Behelit and activates it with his despair at life and desire for power that the sun starts getting eclipsed. This implies that the Crimson Behelit is what brings about eclipses in Berserk, and it's just as well because they're intrinsically tied into what an eclipse means within the context of this world. If you've seen any of our content on Behelits, and you really should if you haven't, then you know a Behelit is an object that basically controls a person's fate. Usually that fate is fulfilled when the person accepts it and turns into an apostle, but a regular Behelit's activation doesn't cause an eclipse. We see the Slug Count activate his Behelit in the first arc of Berserk, and you don't see anything unusual happening to the world outside of the mystery tornado that takes over his castle. This is mainly because, from an astral standpoint, apostles are mere thralls in service to the God Hand, and this thraldom is woven into the fabric of their very being. We've seen apostles like Ganishka try to defy the God Hand from a distance, but when he came within close proximity of a God Hand member, his apostle instincts went haywire to the point that resisting them was driving him insane. An apostle's birth is a fairly regular astral occurrence, all things considered, as abominable as they might be. It's only when a character that can affect the flow of reality itself is born that an eclipse takes place, and that's why it's usually treated as a herald for the birth of a God Hand member. An eclipse takes place once every 216 years, which is the cycle of the birth of God Hand members, with Berserk's main focus being on the 5th and final member. There have been 4 others of its kind, and each of those was associated with the birth of Conrad, Ubik, Slan, and Void, with Voids even being shown to us in chapter 362. But this is the how and the why of the eclipse answered. Let's get into the what, because that's where the real horror lies. What happens during the eclipse ceremony? How long does it last? Can it be stopped? Demonic rituals work on a rather simple principle of exchange within Berserk. Upon activation, your Behelit brings you to an interdimensional plane of existence called the Interstice, where the physical world and the astral worlds overlap and you get to meet the Hellraisers of the anime, the God Hand. The God Hand offers you an escape from your current suffering by enticing you with power and demands a sacrifice in exchange. Once you've decided to sell your soul for a continued existence, the God Hand places the brand of sacrifice on your offering and you transform into an apostle apostle, whose soul is now linked to the abyss, and your first act is to fulfill your sacrifice by devouring your offering, which ends up going into the abyss as well, because that's the ultimate fate of a branded individual's soul anyway. Check out our video on the brand of sacrifice to find out exactly how that works, but the Eclipse is different in that it actually looks for a roster addition for the Hellraisers, as opposed to what are effectively natural slaves for them, and this requires a sacrifice of a different magnitude. When a person becomes an apostle, they're only half linked to the astral world. Their souls might be linked to the abyss, but their physical bodies exist within the physical plane of existence, and they can affect it with their actions, which they more often than not end up doing. What makes a God Hand member different is that they basically exist as a body of thought. The God Hand is a purely astral set of beings, and they can only be summoned to an interstice using a behelit. They can influence world events, but only indirectly, because once you become a God Hand member, you exist solely within the astral realm, and that kind of transition of existence needs a significant sacrifice. And that's exactly what happens during an eclipse. Within the terminology of the series, the eclipse is termed a nocturnal feast, and is considered to be a sacred day for the lambs of the unholy god born of man. This ritual is meant to confirm the ascension of a demon king, who then goes to become the ruler of his lesser apostle subjects as a God Hand member. In the case of Berserk, that chosen one is Griffith. Because an eclipse is considered to be a significant demonic ritual, apostles from all over the land gather to the point of the eclipse in order to partake in the feast. And that feast is the dozens, sometimes hundreds and thousands of people that end up getting sacrificed by the chosen one. The gathered apostles devour the sacrificial offerings, and because their souls are linked to the abyss, the souls of the people they devoured end up getting channeled through the soul of the chosen one as well, like when Griffith felt the deaths of his comrades pierce through him as he descended deeper into the abyss. Once the target of the eclipse accepts their fate as a God Hand and chooses their new form, the blood and guts collected within the interstice gushes towards their physical body and gives it the form they've already selected metaphysically, thus completing the transition. Now, usually there's no one left after the reincarnation is complete, but in Griffith's case, Guts and Casca survived. This is probably why the entire ordeal continued on for at least 3 chapters after Griffith's rebirth, and then the eclipse continued on for a bit even after that. Considering the fact that a solar eclipse can last for hours, but the actual totality only lasts for about 7.5 minutes, we'd have to put the time duration of the eclipse at about the same range. Remember that while everything happening within the interstice feels like an eternity, it's only because time works differently in different dimensions in Berserk. For context, the Skull Knight and Zod fight right outside the eclipse location, and their encounter barely lasts beyond a few exchanges before Skull Knight breaches the eclipse and saves Guts and Casca. And now that we've brought that up, we should also mention that while Skull Knight proved that an eclipse can be broken into, he also proved that it might ultimately be useless in stopping the eclipse's reason for happening because the time dilation effect between dimensions. Considering SK knew about the eclipse for at least a year before it was going to happen, we have to assume he took about a couple minutes to execute his rescue mission, which would make that 7-minute time frame fit pretty closely. Also, you have to remember the sheer number of apostles that were in there, and it wasn't like it was a fight, it was a one-sided slaughter. But with the birth of Griffith and the advent of the proverbial Age of Darkness, one major question remains about the eclipse. Will we see another eclipse in Berserk? This question can only be answered once we learn whether fate and causality are truly cyclical or not within the Berserkverse. There's a lot of debate about the current God Hand itself, and whether it's the only one that's ever existed, or just the current version of it. Before chapter 362, there was no denying the former. Now people argue whether the current one is just a humans-only version, and the old one was a magical creatures-only version, or if it was something else entirely. The Skull Knight often likes to say, all flows as if parallel to that time, because he thinks that everything that's happening with Guts happened to him as well, so the outcome will be the same because everything's a circle. But we tend to agree with his friend Flora on this matter, and we don't think that fate is cyclical in Berserk. Rather, it's a spiral, where one choice can cascade off into multiple directions not preordained by fate. The eclipse as a ceremony is intrinsically related to the God Hand, so we must ask ourselves whether the God Hand will continue to exist after this story is finished, and it seems unlikely. The point of Berserk is to struggle against unfathomable odds and somehow come out on the other side victorious and still standing on your own 2 feet. You might be missing an eye and an arm, but you can replace one of them and do just fine without the other. You still survived a literal nightmare, and you're still alive. The likelihood of another eclipse occurring within Berserk is unlikely, unless it happens when Guts and Griffith have their inevitable final encounter. Even then, it would be more of a motif than a ceremony, as it'll symbolize the sun as it was on the day they met, on the day they separated, and then on the day Griffith decided to become an actual demon. If another eclipse happens in Berserk, you're free to ridicule us in the comments down below, because that would just prove the Skull Knight correct, and he hasn't been wrong so far. But something tells us we're right on this one, and we'd love to hear what you guys think about that down in the comments below. Marvelous verdict. As far as this video is concerned though, afraid that's all we've got for you. The eclipse is what took Berserk to iconic status, and as disturbing as it is, it's also fascinating from a world building perspective because of the things Miura managed to cram into it and then pull off with no effort. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Till then, keep struggling, strugglers.